as we speak, we are aware that many other genocides are happening globally. Sadly, it is not the unusual, it is the norm. The latest figures that we have, and these are estimates, are that nearly 16,000 people have now been killed by Israel in Palestine, the vast majority of whom are women and children. Around 7,000 are reported missing, and there are many more still buried under the rubble. There are tens of thousands who are wounded and now disabled and permanently traumatized for life. We want to take a moment to pay honor to those lives that are lost. Most of what we will do today will be to present you with sources, quoting experts and discursively making links between our specific expertise in our own areas and Palestine and what is occurring there. This is how we often teach what we will do now, and we hope to provide you with a comprehensive toolkit for your own further study. We will be sharing resources and sources as we go. As our colleague, Dr. Serenity Dew reminded us all recently in a letter to the Winnipeg Free Press, teach-ins became popular during the Vietnam War to help circulate knowledge and to counter state lies. Teach-ins centre the oppressed and are anti-racist in their aims. We are presenting here today a diverse group of voices and scholars. Many of us are colonised subjects. Many of us have lived under occupation or in the aftermath of colonialism. And we also acknowledge our Indigenous students, colleagues and community who are here too, and as we witness the ongoing settler colonial genocide in Canada. We have asked for prayers and our event is blessed. We acknowledge that we live and work and speak from the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dean, Métis and Oji-Cree nations. The University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples. Treaty 1, signed in 1871, took this territory from 7 local Anishinaabe First Nations in order to make the land available for settler use and ownership, and it is the homeland of the Red River Métis. I will pass you over now to my colleague, Dr. Brickey. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Alison Brickey. I'm Assistant Professor of English here at the University of Winnipeg. I teach and write about American literature and politics, and I'm currently writing about Jim Crow and racial apartheid in the United States and its relationship to literary modernism. I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the organizing committee to reaffirm our collective right as scholars to academic freedom. As our faculty association, UFA, recently articulated, this freedom includes the right to pursue research and open inquiry in an honest search for knowledge that is free from institutional censorship. This professional freedom is enshrined in our collective agreements and protected under labor law, and our freedom of expression is enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As our collective agreements state, academic freedom does not require neutrality. Rather, academic freedom makes commitment possible and may result in strong statements of beliefs and positions. We affirm the rights of our individual speakers who are not U of W faculty as well. As the Canadian Association of University Teachers makes clear, our academic freedom as researchers and experts also applies to those we choose to invite to our campuses. Our freedom to speak and hold space for difficult conversations thus extends like an umbrella over this entire event. UFA voted last year to not adopt the controversial IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism because of serious concerns shared by many other academic unions in Canada that it threatens academic freedom, particularly as it applies to scholarly critiques of the state of Israel. We have received assurances from the current U of W administration that the IHRA definition will not be applied to our event. Just yesterday, UN officials released a statement expressing alarm at how speech is being stifled worldwide for those who publicly express solidarity with the victims of this conflict. We reject the conflation of the critique of nation states with hate speech, and we refuse the ignorant alignment of the scholarly fields of genocide studies, critical race studies, or decolonial thought with discrimination. Some politicians and colleagues, including professors of peace and conflict, have labeled this event as uneven, non-inclusive, or somehow lacking rigor. We reject these premature and irresponsible mischaracterizations of our event. We condemn the false and misleading statements that have contributed to making this space and our speakers less safe. Our work today is a product of scholarship and research, and we will share resources in the chat and via email with you after the event. Finally, we remind you that we stand proudly as inheritors of the scholarly tradition of teach-ins, a practice that stretches back to the Vietnam War, as professors who are engaged in a collective search for answers in support of the oppressed. Thank you.
So we're using this word genocide, and we're using it very deliberately. And what we're going to do today is offer some sources and resources for scholarly and academic definitions and historical definitions. The word, of course, is a legal definition, and it is a legacy of the Holocaust, which we are always remembering when we use this word. It was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer in 1944, in his book here, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And he wrote, by genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. This new word, coined by the author to denote an old practice in its modern development, is made from the Greek word genos and the Latin word for killing. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, of a set of people, except when accomplished by mass killings. It is intended rather, quote, to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So that is the word as it was first coined by Raphael Lemkin in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And as we know then, it was the convention of the UN in 1948 that gave us some legal terminology for what constitutes genocide: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life to bring about physical destruction, or imposing measures to prevent births, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, many scholars and academics, historians and organizations focus on these definitions of genocide as preventative measures. And so we might think of the temporality of genocide here. When do we get to say the word? And really, it's important to think of the word as a preventative measure. And this International Association of Genocide Scholars, many University of Manitoba and University of Winnipeg scholars of peace and justice are members of this association. And this is their citation of the UN resolution. This global non-partisan organization wants to advance studies on genocide prevention. And again, if we see at the bottom, there is the goal here of prevention. So that's really important, that when we say the word to, it is, in as much as it might be or be heard as an accusation, it is used to prevent. So the International Commission of Jurists have just filed a legal briefer on the 17th of November 2023, citing this duty of states to prevent genocide. And given the scale and severity of Israel's ongoing attacks on Gaza, and at the time there was 11,000 civilians, that number has now risen. At that point, the ICJ urges states to fulfill their international legal obligations under the Convention to prevent acts of genocide in Gaza. And we also want to think about, and this will be something that others will speak more about, of how race making goes hand in hand with genocide, because who gets to have access to that word is something we need to think about, and who doesn't have access to that word. And here Patrick Wolfe, in his famous essay on settler colonialism, says that as practiced by Europeans, both genocide and settler colonialism have typically employed the organizing grammar of race, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, negrophobia, or anti-Blackness. And these are even older than 18th century science-based race, which of course we know is a myth in terms of biological facts. But this does not stop the discourse of race and othering being used to justify what might be termed acts of genocide. The defense minister for Israel stated on the very beginning of the events, on the 9th of October, "We are fighting human animals." And Zoe Samudzi in The Funambulist has written an essay that I urge you to read, asking of how this language of othering works, especially in a framework of human rights that often denies many groups access to human rights. And so we're in a sort of complex situation where we have states like Canada or like the United States that present themselves on the global stage as havens and advocates for human rights, yet also working very hard to deny those legal human rights to certain groups. So how can we understand a framework of and for human rights when the very systems foreclose universal humanity? So this is something we need to think about. Charging genocide. If it is a legal framework, people can bring legal action, as we've seen. And another group of Palestinian human rights organizations filed a charge of genocide on the 9th of November 2023, aimed at holding the state of Israel and Israeli officials accountable for their actions. So this word is very much being used by many organizations and legal organizations. And there is a history to charging genocide as well. In 1951, the Civil Rights Council presented the petition of "We Charge Genocide" to the United Nations, accusing the United States of a long and ongoing campaign of committing genocide against Black Americans. And we can even bring this right back to my special area of research, which is the Middle Passage and transatlantic slavery. Again, if we think of genocide as a system, an ongoing series of policies and not just a singular event. And in this chart, we see Paul Robeson here presenting it, the famous actor, and he says, "This is the result of consistent, conscious, unified policies of every branch of US government." I'll just end with a Palestinian voice. Rabea Agbaria here has written an essay called "The Ongoing Nakba Towards a Legal Framework." It makes it very clear, genocide is a crime. It is a legal framework. It is unfolding in Gaza. Some may claim that the invocation of genocide, especially in Gaza, is fraud. But does one have to wait for a genocide to be successfully completed to name it? This logic contributes to the politics of denial. When it comes to Gaza, there is a moral hypocrisy that undergirds Western epistemological approaches, which mutes the ability to name the violence inflicted upon Palestine. But naming injustice is crucial to claiming justice. Thank you very much.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Arzu Singh. I am an assistant professor at the Women and Gender Studies Department here at the University of Winnipeg. I'm very appreciative to the expertise of my many wonderful colleagues here today who are having this important conversation. And so where I'm going to take us today is particularly targeted towards students who have joined us today. We thought it best to give some broad strokes, foundational knowledge on the fields of post-colonial and decolonial studies, and give some frameworks on how we can think through the violence of the current context in Palestine. And so the term post-colonialism, it refers to the political or cultural conditions of a former colony. And in post-colonial studies as a field, it aims to destabilize the deductive reasoning behind colonial rule of law. So as a field of study, it takes up theoretical approaches within various disciplines that are concerned with the lasting impact of colonization in former colonies. However, within this field, it is important to note, and I'm going to borrow the words of Aimé Césaire, an influential voice within the field of post-colonial studies, where he states that while colonialism formally may be dismantled, the colonial state remains. So there exists a lasting legacy that implicates those who suffered and continue to suffer the effects of colonialism. And the post from the term post-colonial does not actually refer to a time of the past, but rather a past that is part of the ongoing present. The field sort of investigates this very idea of how the ways in which colonial histories have been traditionally distributed through primary texts that found in historical sources that rely on, but also mask histories of racist, classist, and sexist violence to recode the past as having been more equitable than it actually was. So contemporary post-colonial literature have taken up accounts of violence and dislocation and trauma in its work, and you'll find many of my colleagues speaking to that today. And now from this, there are various terms that are important to note within this field of study, and you'll hear them being spoken about in relation to Palestine. So of course, there is colonialism itself, right? Which is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. Again, to borrow from Césaire, the goal of colonialism was not to quote unquote civilize the primitive, but rather to wipe out and destroy whole societies. And so another term that you oftentimes will hear in tandem with the term colonialism is imperialism, which is, it refers to the policy of extending the rule or authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries, or of acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies. So in simple words, and an easier way to think about it is that colonialism can be thought to be a practice, the action, and imperialism, the idea or the theory that drives that practice or action. Another term to consider is neocolonialism. So neocolonialism refers to the use of economic, political, cultural, or other pressures of control to control or influence other countries, especially former dependencies or former occupied states. So it's in other words, it's the process by which powerful, rich, developed states use economic, political, or other informal means to exert pressure on poorer, less powerful states. And this brings me to a term that some of my colleagues have already touched on, but that is of settler colonialism. So, in my discussion today, I'm mostly referring to the historian and settler colonial studies scholar Patrick Wolf that Carrie also just mentioned. But settler colonialism, it can be distinguished from other forms of colonialism by a number of features. Settler colonizers, they come to stay. So settler collectives intend to permanently occupy and assert sovereignty over indigenous lands. And so unlike other types of colonialism in which the goal is to maintain colonial structures and imbalances in power between colonizer and colonized, settler colonialism functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And it is really important to note that, settler colonial invasion is a structure, not an event. So settler colonial states include Canada, United States, Australia, South Africa, and of course, settler colonial theory has been important to understanding occupation in places like Palestine, Kenya, Argentina, and in tracing the colonial legacies of empire that engaged in the widespread foundation of settlement colonies. So just for example, in the Canadian context, what that means is that European settlers or colonizers came to this land to reap its resources and never left, dislodging and violently eliminating indigenous communities that were here before. So the success of colonization is dependent on the elimination of indigenous societies, physically and psychically. And we can see how settler society is thus structured to be a management of maintaining that power and control over the land that was stolen. And again, to quote Patrick Wolf, that Carrie just also just quoted, where he says, settler colonialism destroys to replace. And so in the context of Palestine, Wolf refers to Theodor Herzl, who's the founding father of Zionism, as he states, and I quote, "If we wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct," end quote. So we can see how this logic was carried out in the Nakba of 1948, or the event that is referred to by Palestinians as the Great Catastrophe, a process that entailed an ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes for the creation of the Israeli state, and fostering the conditions for the ongoing genocidal violence against the remaining Palestinian population. Here we can see the example of this type of settler colonial violence as a structure, not as an event. As Rabia Barias explains, the Nakba never ceased, but remains ongoing. And so the violence of this elimination gets absorbed into all colonially oriented structures of society in settler colonial states. So it frames the judicial and legal systems, politics, the medical system, the education system, you know. So from this, it all becomes sort of an accepted practice. That is the cultural and physical genocide of indigenous communities become invisible in a way to settlers within that state. Something that is so weaved into the way settler society works, it becomes accepted by settler frameworks in this logic. So, you know, indigenous ways of life and language, ways of knowing and healing become not just discarded, but actively discredited. So, you know, again, think about eugenics within the medical system, censorship in education systems, mass incarceration, destruction of natural resources, etc. It all sort of begins with the valuing of a settler way of knowing and settler life over any other. And so a thinker that can help us understand this framework of colonial violence is one who I mentioned earlier, who is Aimé Césaire. So just really briefly, Aimé Césaire was a poet, politician, and author and one who laid foundations for many post-colonial thinkers. He was the mentor of the famous critical race scholar Frantz Fanon, amongst many other scholars of color in that era. And so the works that his works that I'm referring to today is his seminal piece on discourses of colonialism. So this work pushes forward the lesson that colonialism, or sort of colonial domination, required a whole way of thinking, a discourse in which everything that is advanced, good, and civilized is defined and measured in European terms. So throughout this work, you know, Césaire points out that the colonizer's sense of superiority, their sense of mission as the world's civilizers, depends on turning the other into a quote unquote barbarian in the minds of the colonizer. It is the process he calls thingification. And so this refers to the colonial encounter requiring a reinvention of the colonized, the deliberate destruction of their past. Again, this is something that we can see in the context of Palestine, whereby a deliberate refusal of its context is insisted upon by Western colonial powers. And this transformation of beings into dehumanized objects or into valued quantities sits at the center of colonial logic. The dehumanization of those colonized works as justification for ongoing genocidal violence. And Césaire states, and I quote him, "No one colonizes innocently, that no one colonized with impunity either," end quote. So the justification of colonization was that it was executed with the intention of supposedly bringing progress and the rule of law to colonized places. But it was all carried out through force of brutality, cruelty, and conflict. In this way, we can see how between colonizer and colonized, there's only room for interactions that are not of human contact, but of relations of domination and submission. And so he explains that colonized places were drained of their essence, culture, and were trampled underfoot, that saw, you know, to quote him, extraordinary possibilities wiped out, end quote. And so he speaks of the consequences of conquest, and he states, and I quote him, I'm talking about the natural economies that have been disrupted, harmonious and viable economies adapted to indigenous population, about food crops destroyed, malnutrition permanently introduced, agricultural development oriented solely towards the benefit of the metropole countries, about the looting of products and the looting of raw materials, end quote. And so Césaire's work on discourse calls on the world to move forward as rapidly as possible, and yet calls for the overthrow of a master class's ideology of progress, one that was built on violence, destruction, and genocide. And he examines how colonialism works to, you know, decivilize the colonizer, and in order to commence on decolonizing projects, it is necessary for us to decolonize our minds. So, you know, both Fanon and Césaire warned those colonized and those post-colonial subjects not to follow in Europe's footsteps and not to go back to the ancient way, but to carve out a new direction altogether. And so this will bring me to sort of the end of what I'm saying here, which is the field of decolonial studies, which as a field really asks us to critically interrogate these structures and to consider what it means to decolonize within settler colonial places and spaces. Decolonial studies examines the conditions in undoing colonialism, and it's a school of thought that aims to delink from Eurocentric knowledge hierarchies and the ways of being in this world. It examines decolonizing as a process that is not just the complete, you know, removal of domination of non-Indigenous forces, you know, within the geographical space and different institutions of the colonized, but it also requires an intellectual decolonization from the colonizers' ideas that oppressed and oppress the colonized. And I'm going to just quickly end on my talk today on a closing thought from Eve Tuck and K.W. Yang's seminal work, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, where they argue that the opportunities for solidarity and decolonial material lie in what is incommensurable rather than what is common across these efforts. And they state, and I quote, "Incommensurability is an acknowledgement that decolonization will require a change in the order of the world. This is not to say that Indigenous peoples or Black and Brown peoples take positions of dominance over white settlers. The goal is not for everyone to merely swap spots on the settler colonial triad to take another turn on the merry-go-round. The goal is to break the relentless structuring and the triad, a break and not a compromise." And that is all for me today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Arzu. I see some questions in the chat here from Andre Pito that genocide is a word that we need to use for Palestinians now, and I hope we've answered that. Lulia Rezvukina asks, if Palestinians and Jewish people were living in the same area, who are the colonizers and settlers? And Liat Schultz asks, what do you mean by European and Western in the context of colonialism and Israel? So I think hopefully the presentation I'm about to give will answer those questions. And this is exactly why we're doing the teaching, because it's important that people have a good, strong understanding of historical facts and context. So I'm about to share my screen again, which is going to dig into the terms of settler colonialism and the history of why we're using that word to describe what's happening now. And I just want to say a little brief word about my own entry into these areas. One of the things that came out in the last few weeks was that Israel asked India to send them 100,000 workers to replace the lost labor of Palestinian workers who were no longer going to be allowed to come into Israel to work. And this is pertinent to my personal history. My family had to leave Uttar Pradesh in the late 19th century to escape famine and British imperial rule, and came over as part of the wave of indentured labor that had to come over to the Caribbean. So this idea of settler states moving around thousands of brown bodies for labor is very much pertinent. And thankfully, India's central trade union, representing 100 million workers, has strongly condemned these talks between New Delhi and Israel to move people to work. And we can see that the conditions in which Palestinian workers are kept as they cross into Israel. So this is a little moment to show you. There's Trinidad, where my family arrived. And they were escaping genocide, a genocide of 100 million and over people who were killed by the British under their rule. And what you see here is an archive of the Futul Rozak's arrival in Port of Spain in 1845, which bore the names of many people who had to travel. And if you look at the muster rolls of these ships, many arrived dead. So let's think a little bit more about this term settler colonialism. On October the 17th, Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted, "This is a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle." So we might turn back again to Patrick Wolf's essay, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, and we can really see that in operation here. And here the logic of elimination refers to the summary liquidation of indigenous peoples. And really, a new colonial society expropriates the land base and seeks to invade via a structure, not an event. Invasion is a structure, not an event. And it requires elimination, which is an organizing principle of settler colonized society. So we can see the applicability in this instance to the moment. But we can go back a little bit to another writer, Fayez Saeg, in 1965, who writes a very important book called Zionist Colonialism in Palestine. And at this time in the 60s, as many post-colonial countries like Trinidad were getting their independence from colonial rule, Palestine was an anomaly. The fate of Palestine, he wrote, thus represents an anomaly, a radical departure from the trend of contemporary world history. Scores of nations and peoples have come to enjoy their right to self-determination at the very time when the Arab people of Palestine was finding itself helpless to prevent the culmination of a process of systematic colonization to which Palestine had been subjected for decades. So before Wolf, Saeg had used this terminology of systematic processes to describe what was happening to Palestinian people. Now, people have asked about the European, why we're using West, why we're using the word European, and it's because Zionism was initially articulated by Theodor Herzl, who was an Austro-Hungarian and who was the founder and president of the Zionist organization, the modern political movement to establish an independent Jewish state. And I often take many of my facts from very accessible sources, so you can look along at the Wikipedia entry for Theodor Herzl if you like. And some of the Google Drives that I've sent you have all his writings and many of his letters quoted in the documents there. There's a whole folder in the Google Drive on Theodor Herzl. And so he had written a Jewish state here to solve the Jewish question. But what we really have to remember in this moment of heightened anti-Palestinian racism is that, of course, anti-Semitism has been a fatal and deadly form of racism at work for centuries, but it is the child of Europe and Western white supremacy. And this is exactly what Theodor Herzl wanted to solve. He wanted to solve the problem of pervasive Western anti-Semitism. And he wrote, "Every nation in whose midst Jews live is anti-Semitic," in 1896. So this led him to say, we need our own nation. Philanthropic colonization is a failure. National colonization will succeed. And in 1902, he wrote a letter to Cecil Rhodes of the idea of Zionism, which is a colonial idea. And so this is another reason why we're using the terms colonialism and settler, because these words were used by the very people who gave birth to the idea of the State of Israel. The New York Times Conference of Zionists here from 1899 says, "The straightforward and comfortable manner," says Palestine Remember, "with which the colonization is pursued in these conferences of Zionists, saying that we will colonize Palestine, it really shows that Zionist leaders depicted their movement deliberately as a colonial mission during a time when European nations were colonial powers and when colonialism itself was not taboo. Britain proudly claimed her empire all throughout the Victorian period and beyond. So again, we think of it as a structure, not an event, not a singular event. Other events that go towards the making of the State of Israel, the Balfour Agreement in 1917, in which Arthur Balfour assured that the British government would support, quote, "a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine." And one of the events that we know that then in 1948 that led to the establishment of the state was the tragic 1948 Nakba. The creation of Israel was a violent process that entailed the forced expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homeland to establish a Jewish majority state as per the aspirations of the Zionist movement. So again, from SAIG, Britain lost no time in creating the appropriate conditions for Zionist colonization. It appointed a Zionist Jew as its first High Commissioner in Palestine. And so the British were very good at colonizing at this point, and they had the apparatus and they knew exactly how to do it. So they helped, but they also helped for self-interest. It recognized the World Zionist Organization as a representative of Jewish agency. It opened the gates of Palestine to massive Zionist immigration. And so this answers the question of why we're using that word of, it describes the actual historical movement that took place despite Arab protests. It transferred state lands to Zionists for colonization. It protected the institutions of the fledgling national home. It permitted the Zionist community to run its own schools and to maintain its military establishment. It trained mobile Zionist striking forces and condoned the existence of underground terrorist organizations. No wonder that by the mid-30s, a British Royal Commission had come to describe the Zionist settler community in Palestine, quote, as a state within a state. All in the meantime, while the Arab majority was denied analogous facilities for self-protection. And we can think of the language of settler colonialism really being deployed recently as well. This is a quotation from the former Israeli Justice Minister on November 2023. Each country, she said, should take a quota of Palestinian people. She says, we need all 2 million Palestinian people to leave. That is the solution for Gaza. And here we can see Israeli flags erected in Gaza throughout November 2023. I wanted to draw our attention quickly to Canada Park in occupied Palestine, which speaks to the congruence of Canadian state settler colonial power with Israel. This park was created when Israel took over Palestinian villages, which were raised on the orders of the Israeli general, and 7,000 to 10,000 inhabitants were expelled and their homes demolished. In 1972, Bernard Bloomfield of Montreal spearheaded a campaign among Canadian Jewish communities to raise 15 million for the park's establishment. So I want to end again with a Palestinian voice, because that's who we are centering today. And you might be familiar with Edward Said, who is a Palestinian-American academic professor of literature. And I'm very grateful for the words that he wrote. This is a poster for him in the West Bank. And he wrote a book called The Question of Palestine in 1979, which again bears reading today. In sheer numerical terms, in brute numbers of bodies and property destroyed, there is absolutely nothing to compare between what Zionism has done to Palestinians and what, in retaliation, Palestinians have done to Zionists. The almost constant Israeli assault on Palestinian civilian refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan for the last 20 years, remember he's speaking in the 70s, is only one index of these completely asymmetrical records of destruction. And we can see how that architecture was built by the British support. What is much worse, he says, in my opinion, is the hypocrisy of Western and certainly liberal Zionist journalism and intellectual discourse, which have barely anything to say about Zionist terror. Could anything be less honest than the rhetoric of outraged use in reporting Arab terror against Israeli civilians or towns and villages or school children, and the rhetoric of neutrality employed to describe Israeli attacks against Palestinian positions, by which no one could know that Palestinian refugee camps in South Lebanon are being named. And so we now have a situation within Palestine of internal displacement, so refugees within your own land and country. So just to end, Said says that the Zionist colonization and anti-Palestinian racism go hand in hand. It was perfectly apparent, he says, to Western supporters of Zionism like Balfour, that the colonization of Palestine was to be the goal of Western powers from the very beginning. Herzl used the idea, Weizmann used it, every leading Israeli has since used it. Israel was a device, Said asserts, for holding Islam and later the Soviet Union or communism at bay. My premise, he says, is that Israel developed as a social polity out of the Zionist thesis that Palestine's colonization was to be accomplished simultaneously for and by Jews and by the displacement of the Palestinians. Moreover, that in its conscious and declared ideas about Palestine, which we've just revised, Zionism attempted first to minimize, then to eliminate, and then all else failing, finally to subjugate the natives as a way of guaranteeing that Israel would not be simply the state of its citizens, but the state of the whole Jewish people. having a kind of sovereignty over land and peoples that no other state possessed or possesses. Thank you. I'll turn you over to the next speaker now.
Thank you. I would like to share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thanks. At the last two presentations, more or less, echoed virtually everything I plan to say. I'm Dr. Chibo Arthur Anyaduba, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg. And I come to this talk from my Nigerian context, as well as my specialization in the study of genocides, especially in Africa. I come from a community that survived and actually continues to experience genocide in Nigeria, genocide that you cannot locate specifically within the Nigerian context, but understand within an imperial system in which the British colonizers and their allies supervised the slaughter of over 3 million people, mostly Igbo peoples in southeastern part of Nigeria today, because of, again, some of the kinds of things we've been talking about. But to start, I want to first thank all those who affirmed strong support for this event, those who reached out to encourage us to remain strong in the heat of some jejune political pressures and harassments and intimidations and different forms of bullying and threats aimed at preventing us from coming together to make some intellectual sense of the horror we've been witnessing unfolding in Gaza and in other parts of the world today. For some of us, the struggle is, as Edward Said puts it, the struggle has been to find fields of coexistence and ethical reasoning rather than fields of battle and cruelty as the outcome of intellectual labor. For me, I think the tragedy of the situation is not so much that academic freedom has continued to be threatened, that intellectual conversations are constantly frustrated and made incoherent, that the framework some of us used to make political sense of reality are increasingly and illogically dismissed as hateful, and we are asked to defend how or why we are not hateful, or how or why our positions can be understood as balanced or not. I think that amidst all this incoherence is the true tragedy of the situation, right? That some human lives have been so historically and presently devalued, so emptied of political and social significance by Western political and cultural institutions, that their deaths, their suffering, are refused even the very least of discourse, right? Tens of thousands of Palestinians are bombed to death, millions of them living through indescribable conditions of death, endlessly shelled, blockaded, and mass-starved for years. And we are pressured to suspend empathy for victims of this horror. We are threatened for protesting the normalized genocide Palestinians are facing in the hands of a deadly Israeli government. Today, to show solidarity with Palestinians and mourn this deliberate infliction of extreme injury upon a people, have been met with brutal cruelty and intimidation. So I hope to use the next few minutes to provide some perspectives for exploring and potentially understanding the condition, especially the historical and present conditions that continue to produce this form of violent devaluing of people's lives. And this condition for me is Western imperialism. And I want to be clear, we live under Western imperial rule. We continue to live and be subjected to Western imperial rule. Western imperialism and colonization of the world never ended at some point in the past. It simply got better at whitewashing and disguising its violence. And to explore the violent character of this thing I'm calling Western imperialism, I want to think with the frameworks of necropolitics and necropower, which might provide some perspectives for thinking about the historical and present conditions that continue to produce the mass deaths of Palestinian peoples and other peoples today. And I borrowed these frameworks from the Cameroonian and South African scholar Achille Mbembe, And my choice of Mbembe's frameworks is also informed by my understanding that his thinking about violence in the contemporary world order is significantly shaped by the Israeli colonial occupation of Palestine and the Western imperialist violence across the world, particularly in the Middle East and in Africa. Necropower, put simply, is the exercise of the right to kill. It is the power to kill with no consequence, the power to profit or maximize profit from killing, maiming, and destroying lives deemed to be without rights or significance. Necropolitics is the politics put in the service of killing populations deemed to be without rights or populations with limited rights. Necropolitics is the governing form of Western imperial system. And since the 15th century, European imperialists have exercised this form of power upon different populations in Europe and across the world. And two extreme expressions of this power involved what today we simplify in describing historically specific violent forms using the terms slavery and colonization. Slavery involved the genocidal destructions of nations, especially nations in Africa, and the forceful transfer of their members to work in European imperialist plantations and mines in Africa, in the Americas, and in other parts of the world. Enslaved peoples were stripped of rights and reduced to conditions of death in life. To live in this condition is to be killed physically, to be killed politically, economically, socially, and culturally. It's to be banished from humanity altogether, to be barred from the future, and as Mbembe would have it, it's to be put in a permanent state of injury. Colonization involved the genocides of indigenous populations and the repopulation of indigenous lands with European and other peoples. Colonization also involved the conquest over indigenous territories and their resources, the occupation of indigenous spaces, the concentration of injured indigenous populations in reserves, in ghettos and in camps, in subaltern spaces. Colonization involved the turning of indigenous spaces into death spaces. Colonization turns nations into sites for the colonizers' raw material and human labor, places where life is constantly wounded and made us unsustainable. So the very making of the so-called modern world of this Western imperium involved the mass deaths and brutal displacement of populations of colonized and enslaved peoples. This imperial world sustains itself by exercising necropower regularly and by ensuring that colonized populations remain in a constant state of injury. To maintain this condition of normalized death and wounding of colonized peoples, to make permanent this condition of regularized exploitation and enslavement, the Western imperial system invented something called racism. The imperial world is governed by racism. Racism is the spirit of necropower. It is what structures relationships under imperialist orders. Racism is what governs the institutions of the Western Imperium. Racism is what the imperialists use to enforce whose experiences can bear historical significance, whose death can be mourned, and whose life is made meaningful. Racism is the magical wand imperialists used to conjure the misrecognition of Palestinian suffering since the 1940s. It's what the imperialists are spinning to force us to not protest and mourn Palestinian deaths today. Racism is the smokescreen imperialists are using to force us to accept that the human lives they are slaughtering and injuring do not matter, that their victims are terrorists who must be eliminated, that the children and the families and the communities that the imperialist war machines are brutally crushing do not have a right to exist in the first place. The imperial world is an apartheid world. Apartheid is normalized segregation. It is a political and economic and social and cultural machinery that imperialists utilize to keep populations in their designated places, to restrict movement and mobility, to condition psychological separation, to enforce our psychological acceptance of suffering inflicted on different colonized populations, to mark zones of life and death. More often than not, the segregationist character of imperial necropolitics manifests in physical geographical separation of peoples in order to normalize a condition of violence and death in one space and a condition of life in another. In apartheid South Africa, for example, Black South Africans were segregated in zones of death where violence was regularly carried out against them and unlivable life conditions imposed upon them. It's the same politics in operation today across different parts of the world, where people can be killed indiscriminately. Hunger and poverty used as weapons of war against populations deemed to be without rights by imperialists or to be with limited rights. That's what has allowed Africa, a continent that is exceedingly rich and self-sustaining, to be the site of extreme poverty and hunger and death today. The history of Western imperialism is the history of segregationist politics, of consigning people in concentration camps, in reserves, in slave plantations, what one might call zones of death. And this segregationist logic is the machinery in force in the open-air prisons known as Gaza and the West Bank today, where for decades, millions of people are blockaded, routinely terrorized and killed, and reduced to different conditions of abjection and death, while the world looks on. So for me, by calling our attention to this condition of imperial power that I have described as necropower, my aim is to encourage understanding of the world we live in as an imperial one and our different subject positions under imperial rule. Thinking critically about necropower in relation to Palestine today might help us to understand the guises of Western imperialism that such thinking exposes, as well as the complicities and complacencies of Western societies tolerating the normalized genocides of colonized peoples, including the one we are witnessing in Gaza today. The fact that the regular mass deaths and mass displacements that Western imperialists carry out are often the basis for the economic, social, and other privileges enjoyed and maintained by privileged members of Western societies, past and present. And I think that understanding the violent order of imperial power at work might also help us, as Edward Said puts it, to try to change the public consciousness and the public imaginary in which Palestine had no presence at all, or in which Palestine is regularly invoked as a population of terrorists or as people whose denial of basic rights is acceptable. And I think the Palestinian poet Mohammed El-Qod's poetry collection titled Rifka provides for me an instructive meditation on necropower and necropolitics, as well as the undying spirit of resistance against imperialism. I recommend his book to anyone interested in exploring the forms of helplessness that characterize the lives and deaths of Palestinians living under the terror of Israeli occupation. And I want to close by reading from one of the epilogues in the book. It's a chapter the author uses to pay due homage to the main inspiration of his book, his grandmother, Rifka El-Qod. Because I'm out of time, I will read just a few portions of this chapter, if only to further contextualize the atrocious power and politics of Western imperialism in the lives of their victims and the condition of helplessness we are asked to ignore today. The chapter is titled, Farewell, Palestine's Jasmine. My grandmother, Rifka El-Qod, passed away on Tuesday, June 16, 2020. She was 103 years old. My grandmother lived through wars and then some. She was older than Zionist colonization. For this, she was hailed as the icon of Palestinian resilience by Jerusalemites. During the 1948 Nakba, she left her Haifa home meticulously clean, not knowing she was readying it for its colonizers. A refugee, cast with her children from city to city, she finally settled in Jerusalem, only to be confronted with the Nakba and the theft of Jerusalem, and in her last days of life, the imminent seizure of the West Bank. She died amid the chaos of the so-called deal of the century and Zionist plans to make Palestinian subjugation permanent and call it a state. Her activism led her from court halls to protests to hospitals. Relentless, she worked until survival became a funny story to tell with what remains of the family. In 2009, Zionist settlers, adorned with backpacks as if going on a weekend camping trip, entered our homes in occupied Jerusalem, escorted by Israeli occupation forces. They claimed that our home was theirs. After a tumultuous battle with two colonial committees in Israeli occupation courts, the settlers seized half of our home. Their takeover was part of a broader effort to ethnically cleanse the entirety of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. We were among We were among a group of 180 Palestinian families facing dispossession orders from Israeli courts that claimed that our homes were built on Jewish lands. Across the street from us, we watched the Gawi family thrown out of their homes set up a makeshift camp on the street on their land where Zionist colonizers settled. As a child, I witnessed my grandmother, 80-something at the time, as a freedom fighter, herself an ambulance, treating tear-gassed protesters with yogurt and onions. In 2009, I saw her rally her body against heavily armed and American-accented settlers and police in our yard as they claimed our land as theirs by divine decree, as if God were a real estate agent. My grandmother suffered from dementia for a year before her death. But despite sometimes forgetting my name, her political convictions stuck. The atrocities she witnessed blanketed her subconscious, so much so that amid her memory's decay, her stories of the Nakba were still highly detailed. Her comments hurled at TV news coherent and complex. A few years ago, my grandmother and I watched men preach about patience on TV. Be patient, for after patience comes relief. My grandmother responded, after patience comes the grave. She demanded justice all her life. And much like James Baldwin, who could not live 6 decades more to see the progress he was constantly promised, progress has taken more than my grandmother's time. We are yet to see the fruits of our decades-old patience. I am heartbroken that she died without having seen a free Palestine, though I promise her that the grandchildren have not forgotten. This fight is a revolution until victory. Rivka embodied that until her very last breath. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Carla Manfredi, and I'm an associate professor of 19th century British literature and culture here at the University of Winnipeg. My brief presentation today is entitled Colonialism and Mapping, and I hope that it will give some visual cues to what many of our previous speakers have been describing. These images are taken from an interactive map produced by the OCHA, that is the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, that feature 645 verified obstacles to the free movement of Palestinians within the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. In early 2023, the OCHA documented 565 movement obstacles in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. These include 49 checkpoints constantly staffed by Israeli forces or private security companies, 139 occasionally staffed checkpoints, 304 roadblocks, earth mounds, and road gates, and 73 earth walls, road barriers, and trenches. Many of these checkpoints are fortified with metal detectors, surveillance cameras, and face recognition technology, and with facilities for detention and interrogation. As I mentioned, there are combined 645 physical obstacles. The map that you see on my slide was created in 2009. This map, entitled L'Archipel de Palestine Orientale, is by the French artist Julien Boussac and was initially published in Le Monde Diplomatique. It is based on documents provided by the OCHA and the occupied Palestinian territory and B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization. there are a few things or few details that I'd like to note or bring your attention to about Busak's cartographic rendering of Palestine. You can see the nautical anchor in the upper left-hand corner. Busak's map effectively transforms West Bank cities and villages into islands, depicted in different shades of green in order to signify different levels of Palestinian autonomy. I've increased and translated Busak's legend, so I'll just call attention to some of the most prominent elements. The dark green areas of the map designate areas with partial Palestinian autonomy. The light green areas indicate total Palestinian autonomy. Green striped areas are natural reserves. The orange areas represent urban areas. The light blue are Israeli colonies. The dotted lines that you can see that go between what look like islands are shipping lines. And on the next map that I'll show you, you'll be able to get a better look at some of the icons, but you may be able to distinguish a few of them, even though they are rather small. There are blue icons that designate airports, little buildings, which are historic sites, palm tree icons, which are protected coastal areas. There are lounge chair icons to designate seaside resorts, wave icons, potential beaches. There are windsurfing icons indicating nautical bases. There is a sailboat icon indicating marinas, blue warship icons designating areas under surveillance, and tent icons representing camping areas. What are some other elements that I'd like to draw your attention to then are some of the effects of the fragmentation of the West Bank into what Busak interprets as an archipelago. Jericho becomes its own island far off to the east. Ramallah is an island in the center of the archipelago, and Bethlehem is severed from Ramallah with a canal and smaller islands peppering the waters in between. Israeli nature reserves, designated by green stripes, take up some of the space of the otherwise Palestinian land masses, and Israeli military roads, signified by the dotted shipping lines, function as the only connecting thoroughfares between the islands. So what I've done here on this slide is simply crop and expand an area of Busak's rendering of the United Nations map, and then try to line it up with the map that he was interpreting, provided by data from the United Nations. So as I previously mentioned, Busak's map is based entirely on data from the UN and B'Tselem, the human rights organization. It is part utopia, populated by names like the Isle of Olive Trees, right in the center, Île aux Oliviers, and Honey Island, at the top of my map, Île au Miel. But it is also part dystopia, with dotted lines signifying shipping links that connect all the Israeli ports to one another. It is also part maritime warcraft fantasy, as tiny blue Israeli warships, zones under surveillance, are positioned everywhere that were permanent checkpoints in 2009. It is, of course, also a mockery of the regulatory regime of the West Bank, with tiny palm trees signifying protected beaches and highlighting how Israel uses the discourse of protected land to secure its own space. Buzak's map illustrates how the Oslo Accords, a pair of agreements between Israel and the PLO, the first of which was signed in Washington in 1993, and the second in Egypt in 1995, fragmented the West Bank into enclaves separated by checkpoints and settlements that maintain Israeli control over the West Bank and circumscribe the majority of the Palestinian population to shrinking Palestinian city and village centers. The map details the impossibilities of both movement and any semblance of conventional tourism in the West Bank, demonstrating how settler colonial state practice can create island formations without water, using checkpoints, walls, fences, and military outposts to disrupt any continuity between Palestinian space. These physical obstacles form part of a range of restrictions that the Israeli authorities have imposed on Palestinians since 1967. Combined, these restrictions impede access to services and resources, disrupt family and social life, and undermine Palestinians' enjoyment of their economic, social, and cultural rights, and of course, undermine their livelihoods. I chose to show Buzak's map because it asks us to consider the fragmented archipelago that the West Bank has become. In turn, it asks us to consider when and how those land masses in between seas of checkpoints and military roads become navigable, and for whom? How can subjects under occupation circumvent the archipelagic logic that divides them? Thank you.
I'd like to thank Carrie and everyone for organizing us today. I know that many in the city have been seeking an event like this, and I'm grateful to be included in such esteemed company. As Dr. Simon noted earlier, this event is a teach-in. I wanted to add briefly that teach-ins were spin-offs of the numerous sit-ins spearheaded by Black civil rights activists during the 60s. Sit-ins were designed as nonviolent acts of civil disobedience to protest the legality of racially segregated public spaces like restaurants, buses, and movie theaters. Basically, I wanted to remind us that teach-ins are just one more thing that we have Black people to thank for. My name is Dr. Serenity Ju, and I'm a professor in the Department of English, Literature, Film, and Media at the University of Manitoba. I work on speculative fiction by people of color, critical race theory, and queer theory. Today, I'll be talking about how we can think about Canada's relationship to Palestine in a couple of different ways. But first, in order to get there, for the majority of Asian Americans, we are in North America precisely because of the workings of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism throughout Asia and the Pacific Ocean, both historically and currently. Whether it is at the hands of the French, Spanish, British, or United States, Asia as a whole is marked by the violence of Western imperialism and colonialism, including many imperial wars. As of 2023, there are over 300 US military bases in East Asia alone. We and our relations are well versed in the experiences and legacies of genocide, war, colonialism, imperialism, diaspora, displacement, and partition. To cite the Association of Asian American Studies, a scholarly organization that recently endorsed their solidarity with Palestine, quote, as scholars of Asian diasporas wrought by colonial and imperial violence, we affirm that advocacy for the Palestinian struggle within and outside of the classroom is aligned with the fight for liberation and against all forms of discrimination and racism, end quote, and this includes anti-Semitism. Asian American Studies is but one of many fields of scholarly research alongside ethnic studies, Black studies, Indigenous studies, Latino Chicano studies, and the like that, quote, emerged through anti-colonial and anti-imperial critique. And thus we will forever commit to solidarity with the oppressed, end quote. In other words, it is not only my ethical or political responsibility to speak out against the injustices of the occupation and genocide in Palestine, as an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist critique, an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist critique is how I'm trained as a scholar and how I continue to see the world in order to conduct my research. I do also note here, going back to Dr. Brickey's point about academic freedom, that the Association for Asian American Studies was also the first academic association in the US to adopt the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel in 2013. And I think those things are not coincidences. It's through this lens of solidarity with the oppressed that I'm able to make links between Canada and Palestine. There's been lots of research done on how and why settler/colonial nations like Canada, the US, and the UK are so pressed to support the Israeli government right now. And Dr. Singh pointed to a lot of these connections, as have other speakers. A long paper trail exists between settler nations and how they have swapped information over the years to accomplish the displacement and attempted genocide of indigenous populations in order to procure land and extract resources. South African politicians visited Canada to scope out reserves for their design of apartheid, as documented by Linda Freeman, Yves Engler, and others. And the Israeli mode of apartheid has been traced back to South Africa as its blueprint. Likewise, settler nations like Canada profit off the genocide of Palestinians, whether currently in the form of weapons and other military supplies, or in the form of speculative investments after quote unquote rebuilding. They bomb so they can rebuild. We saw it in Iraq after the quote unquote war on terror, and we will see it here again. You may have heard of the 12 gas exploration licenses Israel awarded this past October 28th, while it was aggressively bombing Gaza. But another way to connect Canada, quote unquote, Canada and Palestine is through legacies of resistance, mainly through Indigenous resistance. My message here may be a simple one. Listen to Indigenous and racialized voices coming from below, the people who have been doing the work of grassroots anti-colonial organizing for a long time. Alongside other racialized and colonized people, Indigenous people know how to recognize and analyze the tactics of the settler state. I do have a bit of it's worth noting, I'll just explain this, that I've witnessed some instances of Israel supporting Jewish people referring to themselves as indigenous. This is a classic, quote, settler move to innocence, called settler nativism, as outlined by Eve Tuck and Kay Lin Yang, as has been mentioned before as well. Tuck and Yang provide a guideline of sorts of the common ways in which settlers will justify their violence against indigenous people, one of which is to claim indigeneity for themselves. If you're paying any attention, you will see that there are no indigenous populations claiming Israelis as their indigenous kin. Rather, indigenous people globally are standing in solidarity with Palestine. As Kim Talbert and other indigenous scholars have argued, indigeneity is about kinship, about who claims you as kin as much as who you claim as kin, and not about self-definitions of identity. Indigenous people everywhere are asserting that there's no model of a land back movement that is predicated on the genocide of another people. To quote from Red River Echoes, a local Métis collective, quote, as the relations of residential and day school survivors, we know in our bones that targeting and murdering children is the occupiers' means of disrupting entire generations, end quote. While the Canadian government aggressively sides with Israel and hems and haws on even saying the word ceasefire, we can instead turn to local Indigenous collectives to see how they share a vision of a similar connected future with Palestinians. Not politicians, not organizations with influential donors, but grassroots collectives. Red River Echoes emphatically claims, quote, land back also means from the river to the sea, end quote, and they, quote, unequivocally stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people fighting for their lives and homeland, end quote. And I think for those of us who reside on Treaty 1 as settlers, it's part of our obligation to listen to these voices locally. Finally, as a small offering, I'd like to share with you a new to me word, chronopolitics, in the hopes that it can shed some light on how to analyze and make sense of all that we are witnessing unfolding before us. I study science fiction by writers of color, and I came across this word from critic Kodol Eshin. Chronopolitics basically refers to the politics of time and temporality. In other words, it's about who gets to control a timeline, who gets to control the past and what is remembered and forgotten, and who gets to control the future and what is to be forged ahead and what is to be erased. Eshin discusses chronopolitics within the context of Afrofuturism, or the aesthetic and political movement of Black creators deliberately positioning Black people in the future, as the notion of the future was not one that was extended to them. In the case of contemporary Palestine, The idea of chronopolitics may be helpful in understanding who is telling what story and when that story begins. Going back to Dr. Sinanen's talk, when can we call something a genocide? And the emphasis is on both when and we. I'm already discerning a trend of 10/7 being consecrated as a certain day. This is only one way to tell one specific story. There are many other ways to tell this story. In sum, my point today is that those of us who come from people who have survived and continue to survive colonial violence are able to recognize that what is happening in Palestine is settler colonial genocide. Just look at our roster today, filled with scholars of color from so many different backgrounds and races who have committed our entire research careers to these topics. I urge you to discern the racial politics of this moment when racialized and indigenous people globally are overwhelmingly aligning our struggles with Palestine and why this may be so. In 1903, Black scholar W.B. Du Bois famously penned, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relations of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea," end quote. In the 21st century, his words continue to connect us in anti-colonial and anti-racist solidarity. No one is free until all of us are free. Thank you.
All right, my name is Dr. Heather Milne. I'm a professor of English at the University of Winnipeg. I teach in the fields of queer theory, queer literature, women's writing, poetry and poetics, and Canadian literature. Today, I'm going to talk about queer solidarity with Palestine. I'm going to start my presentation by just talking a little bit about a comment recently made by local MP Ben Carr on Saturday, November 18th. Carr issued an editorial titled "Why Israel Matters to Jews." And in this piece, he singled out the local group Queers for Palestine and made the following comment. He wrote, "One of the groups that has been most vitriolic in its anti-Semitic rhetoric is called Queers for Palestine. The irony and hypocrisy of their views is overbearing. They come from a community who, if residing in Israel, would be celebrated and free to be who they are openly. If they lived under the rule of Hamas, whom they claim to be nothing less than legitimate freedom fighters, they would be killed in public squares." I have a few things to say about Carr's statement, and I'd like to begin by addressing it because I think it offers a good teachable moment. In addition to the fact that his comments misrepresent Queers for Palestine and kind of border on slander, they also, I think, position Palestinians tacitly as less civilized and indeed less human than Israelis. Carr is not alone in this thinking. Perusing social media over the past few days, I've read comments similar to Carr's expressing confusion over why queers might support Palestine. On the Facebook page of a local prominent leader within the Jewish community, someone joked in response to this very teach-in that queer Palestinian voices equals KFC chicken voices. And I think this person was trying to joke that a group like Queers for Palestine is somehow akin to chickens for KFC. But this comment really dehumanizes queer Palestinians. It's a joke made in poor taste, comparing queer Palestinians or their supporters to fried chicken. The binary drawn in these discussions between civilized, gay-friendly Israel and backward Palestine is an oversimplification rooted in anti-Palestinian sentiment. Gay rights are a patchwork in Palestine. Homosexuality has been legal in the West Bank since 1951, but outlawed in Gaza since 1936. Queer Palestinian activism has been growing steadily since the early 2000s and is gaining momentum within Palestine and internationally. At the same time, Israel itself is not exactly a safe haven for queer people, contrary to what Ben Carr claims about queers being celebrated to be who they are in Israel. A poll commissioned by Haaretz in Israel showed that half of Israeli citizens thought homosexuality was a perversion. The Israeli army has been known to blackmail queer Palestinians into becoming informants. The rights that the state of Israel extends to its own citizens are not available to Palestinians living within its borders, as many of my colleagues have mentioned today. So the binary drawn by Carr between progressive Israel and regressive Palestine is not as simple as he makes it out to be. Contrary to the views expressed by Ben Carr, I believe that it's important for queer people to stand in solidarity with other marginalized groups, including Palestinians. I don't see this as an ironic contradiction. So I'd like to provide some context that I hope contributes to our understanding of why a queer person might stand in support of Palestine. And to do so, I'm going to read from two texts. I'm first going to read from Sarah Schulman's op-ed, Israel and Pinkwashing, from the New York Times. This is an older piece now, it's from 2011, but it's a really, really clear explanation of the origins of pinkwashing and what it is. Schulman is a Jewish American lesbian writer who's worked in solidarity with queer groups in Palestine. She's a professor of humanities at the City University of New York, Staten Island, and is on the board of Jewish Voices for Peace. So Schulman offers a very clear and accessible description of pinkwashing that's relevant to the ways in which Israel's position as an ally for LGBTQ people is being weaponized right now as a tactic to dehumanize Palestinians and challenge queer solidarity with Palestine, just as the person who compared queer Palestinians to fried chicken did, and just as Ben Carr did in his opinion piece. So this is an excerpt from Schulman's longer piece. You can easily find her op-ed online if you want to read the full thing. She writes, in 2005, with the help from American marketing executives, the Israeli government began a marketing campaign, Brand Israel, aimed at men ages 18 to 34. The campaign, as reported by the Jewish Daily Forward, sought to depict Israel as relevant and modern. The government later expanded the marketing plan by harnessing the gay community to reposition its global image. This message is being articulated at the highest levels. In May, that's May 2011, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Congress that the Middle East was, quote, a region where women are stoned, gays are hanged, and Christians are persecuted. The growing global gay movement against the Israeli occupation has named these tactics pinkwashing, a deliberate strategy to conceal the continuing violations of Palestinians' human rights behind an image of modernity signified by Israeli gay life. Pinkwashing not only manipulates the hard-won gains of Israel's gay community, but it also ignores the existence of Palestinian gay rights organizations. The tactics of pinkwashing also gloss over and silence the work of queer Palestinian activists. There is a growing movement within growing momentum within LGBTQ movements to reject pinkwashing and to stand shoulder to shoulder with Palestinian queers. And a growing number of Israeli queers are also doing this. So those are Schulman's words. Pinkwashing erases the important activist work that's being undertaken both within and outside of Palestine by queer Palestinians. Some of this work is being done in solidarity with Israeli queer groups, and their joint activism can serve as an inspiring model of collaboration. Notably, this work pushes back hard against the kind of pinkwashing rhetoric that we see. So there's a queer resistance to pinkwashing happening within these solidarity movements in the region. Queer Palestinian is not an ironic category. There are queer people in every country and in every culture. What gets lost in the rush to claim Israel as a gay haven in the Middle East is the actual voice of queer Palestinians. So to amplify the voice of queer Palestinians, I'd like to read a statement made by a group called Queers in Palestine. And this is the voice that's actively silenced by pinkwashing. So they write, "We refuse the instrumentalization of our queerness, our bodies, and the violence we face as queer people to demonize and dehumanize our communities, especially in service of imperial and genocidal acts. We refuse that Palestinian sexuality and Palestinian attitudes towards diverse sexualities become parameters for assigning humanity to any colonized society. We deserve life because we are human, with the multitude of our imperfections, and not because of our proximity to colonial modes of liberal humanity. We refuse colonial and imperialist tactics that seek to alienate us from our society and alienate our society from us on the basis of our queerness. We are fighting interconnected systems of oppression, including patriarchy and capitalism, and our dreams of autonomy, community, and liberation are inherently tied to our desire for self-determination. No queer liberation can be achieved with settler colonization, and no queer solidarity can be fostered if it stands blind to the racialized, capitalist, fascist, and imperial structures that dominate us." Growing numbers in the queer community are resisting the way queer identity has been weaponized as a justification not to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people as their homes, hospitals, schools, and universities are being bombed and as children die. Since this is a teach-in, I'm going to end with suggestions for further reading on this topic. These are some more voices that delve into this topic in a deeper way. I'm happy to email this list to anybody who wants it. Yeah, I think I'll end there, and I will pass things over to, I think, our final speaker, who is Dr. Wall.
And thanks so much to all the previous speakers. I'm Sharon Wall from the Department of History. I teach Canadian social and cultural history. And all I want to do now is to offer a few quick tips on how you can continue to educate yourself, and especially how to navigate the world of news and social media. But of course, this is by no means an exhaustive tour of that. So first, I wanted to ask, what makes a reliable source? So as a historian, when I plan a set of course readings or write a new lecture, I want those to be grounded in the best sources possible. So just a few things that I look for. First, that a scholar gives voice to the people most directly implicated. Some make use of oral history, some make use of Indigenous oral tradition, and some are also forced to read other sources, as we say, against the grain. So even government sources or records of the powerful can reveal things never intended by those record keepers if we're looking for it. So, but no matter what sources you use, the best scholarship doesn't rely on a single source. So any issue, past or present, is complex, and we always look to triangulate multiple sources to gain greatest insight. Thirdly, good scholarship analyzes the sources that it brings into play. This means providing context and depth, not just serving up an unconnected string of events. It answers questions like, what are the deeper roots of seemingly unprecedented events? How does one source relate to another on the same issue? So how does Western media measure up to these standards right now? Well, first, don't take my word for it. If you're looking for a viewpoint that's been endorsed by multiple voices, 2 weeks ago, over 750 journalists, now 1,500, have signed on to an open letter decrying the bias in mainstream Western news of Gaza and Israel. And so the letter starts by lamenting Israel's devastating bombing campaign that has killed scores of Palestinian journalists. And at the time of letter writing, 36 journalists have been killed. Today, that stands at over 50, some in the same bombings that are killing other civilians, and others are being targeted, murdered in quite targeted attacks. So making all of this matters worse are the charges that Western mainstream media is failing miserably at its job in several ways. So first, that it's recirculating misinformation spread by Israeli officials, and these are often uncritically repeated as fact or with no counter-narratives. They also charge that media consistently avoid using the precise and appropriate language needed. While UN experts and scholars of genocide have warned that Palestinians are, quote, at grave risk of genocide, the letter charges that Western outlets remain hesitant to quote these experts and accurately describe the existential threat unfolding. And so whether it's our CBC or the CNN or whatever other network you tune into, we never hear a whiff of words like apartheid, ethnic cleansing, or genocide, which scholars, as has been stated here, are fully applicable. And now one exception, I guess this morning, I heard Matt Galloway on CBC say the word genocide, but he was not actually invoking it himself, but rather interrogating the interviewee who used it and why she had used it. So while avoiding the appropriate language, Western news has also been reiterating dehumanizing language, effectively putting a microphone to some of the most atrocious language used by Israeli officials. And deeply linked to the avoidance of accurately naming things is a kind of quantitative bias, you might say, in the extent or really the lack of reporting on Palestinian death, as others have stated. And they cite a 2017 study of another military assault on Gaza. And in that case, the study shows that the New York Times covered a whopping 430% of Israeli deaths and only 17% of Palestinian deaths, a ratio of 25-1. And no question, the same type of thing is happening today. So this amounts effectively to deep silences in coverage that indirectly dehumanize once again. As one BBC journalist puts it, if you can make a people invisible, if you can make their suffering disappear, you control how much sympathy the public has for them. So to look beyond this letter, what's happening to journalists in the West unwilling to follow these rules? Now, quite clearly, reporters are being fired or resigning their positions from major news outlets. New York Times journalist Jasmine Hughes has resigned her position after signing this letter, which was stated as a violation of her newsroom policy. Right here in Canada, Global News has fired Palestinian-Canadian journalist Zara Al-Akras for social media posts of hers. Now, it's also sadly telling to note that since signing the open letter, some 30 reporters or journalists have felt the need to remove their names from the list in fear of workplace reprisals. So in the midst of all this, where can you turn for alternate media? And the few I'm going to mention are all available freely on the internet. So first of all, Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was the first pan-Arab news channel. Some call it the first independent news channel there. Some might debate that. Whatever its funding, it has been experienced by many as a breath of fresh air in Middle East reporting. One Arab journalist refers to it as a new model of disrespectful reporting, braving taboos by opening the airwaves to dissent. From quite different quarter, most recently, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has asked Al Jazeera to, quote, turn down the volume on its war coverage, arguing it constitutes anti-Israel incitement, which does seem to suggest it is ruffling the feathers of some of the world's power holders. So today it offers 24/7 coverage with both Arabic and English programming at any time of the day. You can tune in, hear about Gaza, watch about Gaza and Israel. There's headline news, but also extensive field reporting, interviews, and so on. Sorry. Another source that I have often used for all kinds of social issues is Democracy Now! So this is an American-based progressive news site hosted by journalist Amy Goodman, and most recently joined by Narmeen Sheikh and Juan Gonzalez. And they offer 1 hour of daily coverage. A typical show has headlines, but also 2 or 3 really good segments that really delve into issues where you can really learn in depth about an issue. And there's lots of Gaza coverage. You can also watch all previous shows that have been archived and accessible. Now, if you want a Canadian slant on this, an independent news source, The Breach is a more recently established Canadian independent news source. Settler colonialism and Indigenous rights are among one of its key issues. Pam Palmater is one of its regular contributors. And in terms of the Israel-Gaza issue, it is very useful in clarifying Canada's role in offering unthinking support for Israel. It's got some great clips, catchy, useful in teaching or wherever. One of its key journalists, Martin Lukács, has done a real deep dive on what he calls the Trudeau formula, that allows Trudeau to seemingly play both sides of so many issues. You know, on the one hand, sharing sympathetic words in public, sometimes now with, humanitarian words for the Palestinians, but keeping up conservative style, unshakable support for Israel behind the scenes. Okay, so finally, what about social media? And I realize this is the place where many of us probably go instinctively, that it's our first choice these days. And clearly, when allowed to function freely, social media can and has been a force for social change. It's the most immediate news source. We know journalists are sometimes going there for their stories. It's people on the ground. It's people uncensored at its best, of course. But we know it doesn't always function that way. And creeping forms of anti-Palestinian censorship are creeping into all kinds of platforms. Meta has shut down certain accounts. Eye of Palestine, which had something like 6 million followers, has been shut down. TikTok is placing graphic warnings for images of suffering Gazans. And Twitter is also sort of shielding material under its sensitive content label. But apart from censorship, of course, we know people with hateful agendas also use social media, and the real problem is how to navigate it. So I'm just going to say a few words about Twitter. That's the one I use most commonly, and maybe just about how to search. So certainly you can search, hashtag Gaza, and you'll find hundreds, probably thousands of tweets, and sometimes they do. Another suggestion, why not start with a trusted source, perhaps a scholar of genocide or a known activist, and see who and what they're following and posting, like following the footnotes of a trusted article. And so this is exactly what I did when I started looking for more context and depth, 6 weeks ago. I looked to just a personal, someone that I knew, Canadian activist and scholar Harsha Walia, a critical thinker on borders and migration and race. And as I hoped, at her site, she was directing people to a whole host of sources, a kind of Palestine 101, to learn more about the deep context of what was unfolding. And so in the days following, I found another amazing source via her account. And it's a website called Can You Tell Us Why This Is Happening? And essentially, people in Gaza are sending out voice messages to relatives and organizations. Volunteers are transcribing and translating them so that we can read them online. And so I'll end now with just one of these as we recenter ourselves again on the words of the people at the center of this catastrophe, this genocide. From Nizar, October 13th. We feel very close to death here in Gaza. We really feel death every second. We smell death everywhere. Without shelters or safe spaces, we are exposed to massive attacks, massive strikes that are wiping out whole neighborhoods. It's hard to look into the eyes of my little children when all you see is fear and tears, and you feel that you're not able to protect them or save them. So if this angers you, if this outrages you, please join the Palestinian community in Winnipeg, join us down at the legislature tomorrow, learn more, participate, take action. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for all those amazing presentations from our multiple perspectives. We've seen some comments in the question and answer saying that these are not multiple perspectives. And I just want to say very clearly that that's a very racist viewpoint. This is a very inclusive and really packed teach-in that includes many of us coming from different backgrounds, ethnicities, countries, and academic disciplines. So I just want to emphasize that. There is mention of a second session. Yes, the sign-in for that is the roundtable that will start at 2 o'clock. And I think we've answered most of the questions, for which we're very, very grateful. And people have been sharing really good resources. There's the link for registering for the roundtable this afternoon, which will centre Palestinian voices and also Jewish perspectives on really people's lived experience. We've sort of done the academic bit, and we're thankful to all of you for being here with us. We're hoping to record this and to put it on YouTube. And so thank you for all the support and feedback. We've really appreciated it. Thank you so much.